All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Fields, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I am delighted to welcome you to this, our first session in our 2021 edition of our outreach program for teachers, which we call East Asia in the Upper Midwest. This is the second year that we've ran this program. Last year, we did a similar program focused on the Korean War. And this year, as you all know, we are doing a program on Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan. The nature of things being as it is, what it is. Last year's program was virtual. This year's program is also virtual. Hopefully, at some point, we will have some in-person opportunities to do some of this program, but we will take the opportunities we're given. And one of the great things about Zoom is that originally this program was designed as an outreach program to Wisconsin teachers, but we have teachers with us right now from all over the United States, many from Wisconsin, but also from the East Coast and the West Coast and many places in between. So thank you so much for joining our program. I hope that you've enjoyed the materials that we've sent you on Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan. I hope you've had some time to think through them and think what sort of questions you might want to ask our scholars over the next few weeks, and think about how you would like to introduce this topic in your classrooms. So without any further ado, I will introduce our speaker, our scholar, who's going to be joining us in conversation today. Our scholar is Dr. Kevin Nute. Dr. Nute's work focuses on the transcultural significance of traditional Japanese architecture. He is the author of Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan, published in 1993. Also the author of Place, Time, and Being in Japanese Architecture, 2004. Naturally Animated Architecture in 2018. This Here Now, Japanese Building and Architecture, Japanese Building and the Architecture of the Individual, in 2020, and most recently, The Constructed Other, Japanese Architecture in the Western Mind, published in 2021. Kevin received his architectural training at the University of Nottingham before working in practices in London, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He earned his doctorate at Cambridge and has been a visiting Fulbright Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and a Japan Foundation Research Fellow at the University of Tokyo. He taught at the Muroran Institute of Technology in Japan and at the University of Oregon before joining the University of Hawaii at Mānoa in 2019. And I just want to say that we knew that we were going to do Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan as a topic almost 4 years ago, but it wasn't until late last summer that I started doing the research on who we were going to get as a scholar for this topic. And when I just Googled Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan, the book entitled Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan was the first thing that came up. And it was so delightful to find out, wow, someone has written a book with the exact same title of the topic that we're going to do. And then the minute I saw Dr. Nute's bio, I was convinced that he was the right person to talk through these issues with us today. And as you probably realize, Dr. Nute is also the person who wrote the curricular guide on this topic that you have all received. So please, let's give a virtual welcome to Dr. Kevin Nute.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Kevin. And how we were going to structure this conversation is all of you have already read through some of the materials and have submitted questions. So I was going to start by just posing some of the questions that you have already submitted that Kevin and I have looked at and we're interested in. Kevin will answer a few of those. And then every 2 or 3 questions, we will pause and open it up to anyone on the floor to either ask a follow-up question related to something a question that's already been discussed, or to take us in a different direction. If you want to make sure that you have a question that gets answered in the session, please use the raise your hand function, or I guess wave at the screen very vigorously. And I will try to make sure that no questions get missed, or feel free to drop a question in the chat as well. All right, so Kevin, for our first question to get us started, it's a question from Janet Payne. And she asked a really foundational question about Frank Lloyd Wright. And that was, if his mother had not predetermined that he was destined for greatness and molded him into the man she wanted him to become, do you believe that Frank Lloyd Wright would have succeeded to the level of architectural genius that he has achieved?
Thank you, David. I should preface, and I was just talking to David, it's still just about morning here, but good evening, I think for most of you. I should preface what I'm going to say with I think it's an obvious fact that I'm not a psychologist. I'm not even an architect, actually. I'm not a registered architect, which has never stopped me talking about architecture, but I am more reticent about talking about somebody else's thought then, in the sense of, but I'm willing to give an opinion, but please don't take this as sort of as gospel. I never had a conversation with Wright. He never explained to me, or I think to anybody really, what his motives were beyond architecture. So, but to answer that question, Janet's question, then I think personally that Wright's mother gave him both an unusually early focus and a powerful motivation that were critical to his architectural achievements. So in other words, I think he got a running start, and he also had, your parents' opinion, your mother's opinion, especially in Wright's case, that stays with you, So I think it was a double advantage that, he didn't spend time kind of wallowing around like most teenagers do, thinking about, well, what am I going to do? What am I interested in? He had the most amazing head start, and he had this powerful drive coming from his mother. You could call it pressure, I suppose, to succeed in that. So whether that's right, or no pun intended, whether that's a good thing or not, I think there's no question that it gave him a special. You have to have the talent, but in terms of motivation and an advantage in terms of preparation, then I think they did play an important role. In other words, were it not for her, I'm not sure that he would have become an architect. And if he had, would he have been the same? I doubt it. I don't know for sure, but I think it's a great question, because I'd never really thought about that. But he does owe his mother, not only his being, but also, a large part of his career. Again, some parents would say, that's awful. You should be free to make up your own mind about your own career, and but I think there's no doubt in my mind, at least. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I think it's a fact.
All right. Thank you for that, Kevin. And I think as probably a lot of people out there with children, you always wonder whether you will actually have an influence on your children. And it's really impressive to see a parent make that commitment and actually have it turn out. So, so the next question, and these first few questions, we were going to kind of focus on maybe Wright's upbringing a little bit. So the second question is a question that was asked by Sabrina Jeffries, and that is, what is it about the landscape of Wisconsin that so influenced him to become who he became? And I know one of the terms often associated with Wright is the Prairie Style, and I think that's what that's getting at, that question.
Yeah, I think you're right, David, and that's where my mind went when I saw this question. I think that Wright understood belonging to be a fundamental human need. And he recognized that buildings had the capacity to help us fulfill that need to belong. And he saw that in many cultures, but I'm somewhat biased, but particularly in Japan, he commented on it, that the buildings seemed to fit their landscape and even resemble their landscapes. Now, I'm not suggesting, well, I suppose I am in a way that, maybe there was an influence, that relationship with the landscape. But back to Wisconsin, I've been there a few times, and I actually thought, well, gee, I need to remind myself, what does the landscape of Wisconsin actually look like? And I don't know if I can do this or not, but I'm going to share my screen, which might mess things up. Oh, you've disabled my screen sharing. Well, that won't work.
I've enabled it, Kevin.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I should have given you a heads up. I had a chance. Let me see if I can do this. Yeah, it's not showing me. Let's see if that will work. Yeah, this is. Yeah, it's. Okay, because I just switched computers, David, I need to read. What I did, though, not particularly cleverly, was to look up some images of Wisconsin landscape to remind myself. And then I looked up Wales, the home of his mother, at least his mother's ancestors. And wow, it's remarkable. Apart from the closer hedgerows, you couldn't really tell which was Wales and which was Wisconsin. So I don't know, but he always talked about Taliesin and Spring Green as the kind of ancestral home. And I think that was probably quite common, that, that the Welsh were there because it reminded them of home. So possibly, although Wright, to my knowledge, I don't think he ever visited Wales himself, and he couldn't just Google it like I could. But I think it's really a matter of a sense of belonging to the landscape, and the notion that architecture can help us to do that. It helps us to dwell, literally in the sense of stay in one place, but psychologically, to feel that we belong in that place. And although it starts in Wisconsin and the prairie, which I think he convinced himself that Wisconsin was the beginning of the prairie. Now, I think geographers would probably, quibble about that, but he felt, he even talked about Oak Park, being on the prairie. Well, possibly, before O'Hare existed, and maybe it was pretty prairie-like out there. So, but I guess my point is that to be quite honest, I don't know the answer, whether it was Wisconsin per se, because he applied that sense of belonging through buildings in many other places, in the Southwest, in even in Japan, on a small scale. So I don't know if there are structures within Wisconsin that would have triggered that. I would get into a long chain of supposition about, I have a theory that one of the reasons that Wright went horizontal was because he was trying to get out of the shadow of Louis Sullivan, who was known for extremely vertical buildings. And if you just got fired by your illustrious mentor for designing houses, well, first of all, you don't want to be associated with that mentor, right? Certainly not imitating them. And what better way to prove you're just as good by saying, I'll do the opposite to you and I'll do it better. So again, I'm guessing here, and then you can post-rationalize, well, long and low, it belongs to the prairie. And the reason I would even mention this is the kind of thing that architects do. They will have a vision for whatever reasons. And then afterwards, they'll give you a very logical reason for why they thought that up, which came after. It's, I don't think it's wrong, but it's certainly the fact that a lot of explanations by architects of their own work is post-rationalized. There's another motivation. And I honestly don't know where, I'd be fascinated to know where he first came across that idea. Actually, thinking about it, the notion of organic architecture, now I'm finally beginning to think about this, that did have, one of the implications of that was the idea of the organism adapted to its environment. And that's sort of an evolutionary idea that was popular in North America, but popular particularly in Chicago amongst architects. There's this notion that, and the reason it found a home in Chicago was trying to find its feet after the fire, and wanted to establish its identity, just as Wright wanted to differentiate himself from Sullivan. Chicago wanted to differentiate itself from its big cousin, elder brother on the East Coast, New York, and to a lesser extent Boston, but certainly New York. So this idea was not unique to Wright and Sullivan. It was kicking around in Chicago architectural circles, that Chicago needs to have its own architectural identity. And part of that was the tall office building that Sullivan and Adler pioneered in Chicago. So I think it's wrapped up in this notion of the organism adapted to its particular environment, and it's going to look different wherever it is. The answer, that wasn't even the answer that I prepared. So but that's the best one I can give you. It's a great question.
I like the comment that often these explanations are developed after the fact, and reminds you
Sure.
that architects are humans just like everybody else, and sometimes
Yeah,
the
all too
explanation
much.
that we give, a year later is not necessarily the one we would have given at the
No,
time.
it is pretty fascinating, but I've recognized myself doing it,
Mhm.
and I talk about it to students, and to me, it doesn't really matter which came first, the chicken or the egg, as long as they make sense together. I don't think it's dishonest.
Yeah.
I think the main person that's being fooled here is the practitioner. It's possible to convince yourself that this is actually what happened, and it's myth. It's not.
All right. Well, I will. I'll ask one more question off the list, and then I'll invite you on the floor if you have a question in mind. Raise your hand, wave vigorously, drop something in the chat. But Kevin, we have a really interesting question here from Colleen Dowling. And it says Frank Lloyd Wright incorporated his religion into his first symbol or marker. It was a cross resembling a Celtic cross. And she references Seacrest's book where you can see an image of this. But then she points out later in life, he changed the symbol to a red box, almost like a printer's chop signature. Does this change in his symbol design represent a change in his religious beliefs? And if so, did this change or affect his future work?
Wow. Yeah, this is the shortest answer. Well, it won't be the shortest answer, but I don't know that Wright was religious with a capital R. I think he had his own version of religious. I don't know. There's been speculation. Of course, his uncle was a Unitarian, which I believe has been. I think they declared themselves as not Christians, not that long ago. That they don't believe in. I'm not an expert in this, but I may be wrong with that. But it's always been an open question as to whether into Wright's beliefs. He worked on religious buildings, but his own belief, he was never very forthcoming about that. He did famously say that he believed in God, but he just spelt it Nature. So as for the change of symbol, gee, I think a psychologist would have a field day with that, in the sense of the Celtic cross clearly goes back to the old world and to Wales, places like that. I'm actually from Cornwall, which is even more remote than Wales, and supposedly Celtic. And they do feel a sense of difference. They identify, the Cornish identify themselves as Cornish and the Welsh as Welsh, in ways that they differ from the English. It's the other, so you could interpret that change, which I'd never really paid any attention to until it was brought up by Colleen's question, as one looking back, and then when he discovers the real New World, right, which ironically was a much older world, but it was new to the West in the Far East. So he's looking back to the old world in the New World, and then he discovers an even older world, which is new again, because the circle's closed. And so I'm waffling here, as you can probably tell, but I honestly, because we don't know his original kind of religious beliefs, it's hard to know if there was a change, obviously. But I would. He read Hegel, and I think he certainly believed in spirit, and so he was religious, but I don't know that he was ever really part of an organized religion. I think you could see, and somebody asked me from Taliesin recently, emailed me and asked me, what about all these Chinese sculptures kicking around at the two Taliesin's? What was all that about? And is there a Buddhist, Taoist? And I think the answer is that he saw things that resonated in many religions, and certainly in Taoism. And and to maybe to a lesser extent in some aspects of Buddhism. And before, I mean, I'll let you in a small secret here, not really a small secret, but before Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan was Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan, it was going to be Frank Lloyd Wright and Taoist thought. So thank God I bumped into Stephen Toberiner at Berkeley, and he said, well, you can't just write about that. You have to write about Japan. I said, really? You know, I can't believe I said this. I have to go to Japan, you know. Well, I thank Stephen Toberiner effusively late, just within the last few weeks, because this started making me think about this. So I would say, I honestly don't know the answer definitively, but Wright's, if I had to guess, I think his religion would be more animistic, you know, and certainly a belief in spirits in a more general way. But that's not a great answer to your question, Colin, and I'm not doing justice to the quality of the question. To some extent, I speculated on whether Wright was building temples to things like the family, etc. But I know that's a different, you know, I'm off there. So it never really, I definitely speculated on his affinity with Taoism, because Taoism was kind of a license to do whatever the hell you wanted and not obey Confucian controlled society. It's not a surprise why that would appeal to somebody like Wright, right? So, and a lot of his friends connected with Japan, people like Okakura dressed in Taoist clothing at a time when that was not a cool thing to do in Japan, you know, modernized in Japan, you know, dressing in sort of goat skins and with funny hats, and, you know, and Okakura likewise was a complete iconoclast, you know, in a country like Japan, even less acceptable than it would have been in early 20th century Oak Park. You know, this is a guy who, well, broke some of the, you know, most important rules in Japanese society and was ostracized to some degree, you know, as a result, you know, because the consequences were even more serious there. So there's a strain of individualism and you know, so Taoism, I think, you know, would have appealed to Wright. And he had books, as I recently discovered in that conversation with Taliesin. They were saying, well, you know, that seems very speculative. And I said, well, you know, that's true. Then I looked it up, and there's now a Frank Lloyd Wright library online that Paul Turner at Stanford unearthed and put together. And lo and behold, in that list of books are multiple titles on the Tao Te Ching. Why have the books if you don't read them? Well, actually, I have books that I have. So I have plenty of books that I haven't read. So, but that came as a surprise to me. I wish I'd known that 30 years ago when I was speculating, because it actually confirmed that a lot of the things that I was trying to make a case for tortuously, actually, you know, I could have, if I'd known, said, well, he owned these books. And, you know, I mean, sure, I can't prove that he read them, but it would have saved me a lot of time if I'd actually known that all those books. The problem was that they were all in different libraries at the two Taliesin's and in Oak Park, etc. But yeah, you can look this up online. I'll give the link to David. But I only discovered that within the past week. It was like, wow, this is great. You know, I don't have to make the case. You can see what he was reading, and sure, you know, you can't necessarily conclude absolutely, but it does make a pretty compelling case that he read what he was interested in, and presumably some of those readings would have influenced his thought. So I would recommend, and I'll send the link, as I said, talking to or looking up Paul Turner's index of Frank Lloyd Wright's library. Very revealing. I think it's going to change Frank Lloyd Wright's scholarship. You may find some things in there that, you know, because I don't think it's really, I think it only got up there in 2017, and I only was aware of it recently. So I think there's going to be new scholarship based on great work by Paul Turner to actually pull that together. I wish, as I said, I'd had access to that 30 years ago. All right, David. Sorry, I've waffled on, having said it was going to be a short answer.
No.
When somebody doesn't, I'm talking to teachers, of course. So when you don't know the answer is either very short or very long. And I think I just proved, that I don't know the answer.
All right. Does anyone have a question from the floor? Either any follow up to what we've just said, or a question you want to make sure gets answered. I'll pause for 4 or 5 seconds or so. If not, we'll just get back to the questions that you had submitted. Just raise your hand visually or virtually, or do some of this, or put it in the chat. All right. Well, then let's proceed with your submitted questions. And Kevin, we have a few more questions here that I think are important related to personality, but we will get to the more concrete topics, pun intended, of Wright's buildings in just a few minutes. There's so much possibility for puns when you deal with Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is a question from Catherine Ishida, who says Frank Lloyd Wright was clearly a genius but struggled socially. Particularly in the Ken Burns documentary, we heard a lot of different people's descriptions or takes to juggle the positive and the negative of Frank Lloyd Wright, the man. What is your take, Kevin? And as you've told us, we know you're not a psychologist, but you've thought about this man for decades now. And how do you balance those two things? Or don't you? Do you not even think about the one?
Well, as I was sharing with you, David, for a long time, I actually wouldn't look at the books that were about Wright that were not about architecture, because I felt like, well, the two things are not. Now that's changed in 30 years. I'd be surprised if it didn't change. But clearly, we live in a different society today, and that kind of question in today's sort of cancel culture has become a big question. Just what is the relationship between someone's works and their own personal actions? So I don't think it's acceptable to just say, well, although this would have been my answer 30 years ago, that they are, I mean, one answer would be you admire the work and condemn the behavior, and and some people would say you can't do that. Those two things are not compatible. That probably would have been my answer 30 years ago, but now I think the answer would be, since you can't draw a hard line like that, at least for everyone, and this is not a very acceptable answer, I have to admit, but it's the best I can do, would be that everybody has to decide on a sliding scale where their line is, what they are prepared. I'd kind of like there to be a hard line between the work but if clearly, you can find plenty of, sadly, you can find plenty of examples of really heinous behavior. Now, I don't think Wright was, there may be things in Meryl Secret's book that I'm not aware of, but I'm not aware of any really, terrible, he didn't kill anybody. I don't think he abused his spouses, although there may be speculation on that now, but he did get married. Some people would say, well, gee, he married all of these women. He didn't just mess around, So again, I don't want to come across as somehow making excuses. I can't. But here's what I wrote in response, which is that I think, and here's where David's correct, this is what I've probably carried in my head. I think the Wright understood or believed that he'd been blessed with a unique talent. And much of his impatience with an apparent self-serving could be seen as efforts to protect and do justice to that gift. Now, I'm not saying that that's justified at all, but I'm trying to kind of get inside of his head, which I'm not comfortable doing. And, but here's where I can't identify. I don't think I was blessed with any unique gifts, but if I were, there might be a sense of, well, this gift is more important than anything, and that, I can't let anything get in the way of this. And therefore, I'm responsible to a higher authority, I suppose, than social norms. And now he was dismissive of social norms anyway. The Taoists were. It's like, some bureaucrats decided to make up these rules. Why should I kind of obey them? So that's just downright arrogance, I suppose. And the right tried to blunt that by saying, I'm honestly arrogant, not falsely modest. So every time somebody tried to nail him with these sort of accusations, he would say, I'm actually more honest. I don't run away from this stuff. If I love somebody, I follow that, and I'm not just going to mess around with them in secret and keep a veneer over my happy family. I'm not prepared to live a lie like that. If I love somebody, I'm going to do the unthinkable and leave in pursuit of that, and I'll take the consequences. He did. Now, lots of people have said, yeah, sort of what happened at Taliesin was Frank Lloyd Wright's fault. If you follow that regressive argument, it just, I don't think it goes anywhere useful. But that was, of course, what was said, that the terrible tragedy at Taliesin was Wright's fault. This was divine retribution, and that must have been enormous pressure on him. But coming back to the question, then, I think he did feel that he was in possession of something that didn't really belong to him, that was really, really special, and that he had to protect it. And perhaps, taking money from people that he probably wasn't going to repay was like, you're just making a contribution to this incredible thing that's bigger than both of us. I don't know. I mean, again, I wasn't in the room, but to convince people that, to part with their money, people like Darwin Martin and others, I think there must have been a sense of, this is not just some arrogant, self-serving con man who wants to make a reputation. There's something bigger here. I don't know, but that's what I've thought, at least, that somehow he could justify to himself not obeying the rules because he was in possession of something that was so special. But I don't think that's a justification. But I've never been in that position, and I don't know what I would decide if I ever was.
Honestly arrogant instead of falsely modest. I think that's I want to read an article on Frank Lloyd Wright with that title in it. Great. And Kevin, I feel like with that answer, you've touched on something that was going to come up in the next question, which is by Wendy Harris, when she says Seacrest emphasizes Wright's irresponsibility around money and some other topics, and that Wright's friends bailed him out repeatedly. I find it intriguing that people would continue lending him large amounts of money when he had a reputation for never paying it back. And you've kind of hinted, do you think that they understood that any money they gave to Wright, they might never get back, but that they were supporting something that was larger? They were supporting the arts in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I was kind of answering that question at the same time, but yes, I don't know, but I suspect that at least some of those people were mad afterwards, and they came after him legally, and one guy broke his nose, in Madison, I believe. There's a famous photograph of Wright in court with a plaster across his bridge of his nose. So it's not like everybody felt like they were making a voluntary contribution to the Frank Lloyd Wright Benevolent Fund. I mean, a lot of people got seriously bent out of shape. The bank didn't see it that way. They foreclosed on the mortgage on Taliesin. So, for everyone who felt like, okay, I need to do this because the work is so great, there were probably, I don't know, 6-8 people who were like, I want my money back with interest, So I'm not suggesting that everybody felt like that. Yeah. But of course, Wright seemed to feel that everybody should. He was probably shocked when people said, we were serious, we want our money back. I wonder, I'd love to have been in the room when Wright talked to the bank manager about the mortgage on Taliesin. I mean, he must have tried, I'm sure, to say, how can you do this? America's greatest living modern architect. You can't do this, you know. And the bank, of course, says, yes, we can. so yeah, it is kind of, I forgive me, Wendy, I kind of answered your question in answering the previous one, and it's only a theory. I honestly don't know, you know, but in terms of justifying that, Wright was not some scurrilous con man, in my opinion. You know, he believed that this was an incredibly important project, but where it crosses over into personal ego, I don't know, really. And there was a huge element of that, of course. It would be hard not to be to feel like, well, yeah, you know, it's not my possession, but it is, you know. I wonder if Wright himself could draw a line between the gift and his. I honestly don't know. You know? But it comes across as arrogant, of course it does, you know. And in some cases, it probably, you know, that was an accurate description. You know? But there are many descriptions, admittedly from people that liked Wright, of his kindness, you know, that he wasn't inherently a mean personality, you know. He didn't suffer fools gladly, but he wasn't, you know, didn't go out of his way to be mean. But I probably listened to a non-representative sample of, I think he played off the persecuted genius image. He was very aware of it quite early in his career, right? And especially after he left his family in Oak Park. And I think it was a form of self-defense, you know, survival, to say, you know, of course they hate me, you know. Geniuses, prophets have always been hated in their own time, you know. And he would often say, you know, the only people that really recognized me were overseas. You know, not true. You know, there were plenty of critics in America, but he needed this persecution, supposed persecution, to as rocket fuel. It's like he got mad about it, and I think it did spur him. It's like, I'll show you. You know, how dare you? You know, well, I think it really did fuel him. You know, which is kind of sad, but I've heard it. You know, that kind of slight or criticism, you know, you can either be crushed by it or it can make you even more the way that you're being criticized. And I think clearly, you know, Wright would just sort of say, you don't like it, well, I'm not going to change it. I'll be more like that and I'll do better work. And that was his response. So I'm not suggesting that would be something that you would teach your students, you know, but again, I'm speculating. Which is great fun, but to be taken with a liberal dose of salt.
I know in asking a lot of people around Wisconsin in the work of planning this event, if there's one piece of received wisdom about Wright that circulates, is just how unpopular he was at Richland Center. And of course, this is all anecdotal, but it seems to be the one thing that everybody knows about Wright. Oh yes, he did not have a good reputation in town. Oh, all right. If I don't see any hands raised virtually or otherwise, but again, feel free to drop something in the chat or to wave vigorously. But let's pivot, Kevin, and let's talk a little bit, kind of maybe leave personality issues for a side. Let's talk a little bit about his buildings. And we have a question here from Janet Payne saying, do you think Frank Lloyd Wright preferred to build homes or public buildings? And did he build for pleasure or did he build for recognition? What are your thoughts on those questions?
Right, great. I hope we answered, there was one question that I think you skipped over, but I think I kind of covered it in some of the other answers, David, so
yeah,
that satisfying. I think the dwelling, to answer this question then from Janet, the dwelling was where Wright's career began. Really. You know, that's how he got fired, by doing private houses on the side whilst he was working on mostly public office, well, at least commercial buildings for Adler and Sullivan, right? Public buildings were more about recognition. Still the case, you know, that it's hard to make a reputation in architecture even today without doing some public buildings. You know? But I think homes he would have designed anyway. He couldn't not do that, right? But public buildings were something that, if you wanted to be a recognized national, international architect, you needed to have done some public buildings. But the house, the dwelling, was his forte. And as I said, if you look at the number, it's harder to get, obviously, public and commercial commissions. But if he'd done nothing but houses, he would have been still considered an extraordinary talent. Did he build for pleasure or recognition? So pleasure, I think, to split your question, dwellings for pleasure, public buildings for recognition. It's a great question. I never thought about that.
And Kevin, as someone who studies architecture, can you give us a sense as the difference in amount of work? I mean, I assume it's exponential in the difference between a house and a public building.
Yeah, that's a really good point, David. You really have to do your research and start from an open kind of mind. Although Wright had a certain type for his, which was actually the spatial inverse of his dwellings. His dwellings had a firm roof, a solid center, and an open periphery. And his public buildings were the complete inverse. They had an open to the sky center. Think of the Larkin Building, Unity Temple, the Guggenheim Museum, right? Johnson Research, right? But their periphery was, because they were in urban surroundings, right? Deliberately solid, closed off. So yes, far more work involved in public buildings. You would have committees in some cases and various invested parties, whereas with a client, Wright was notoriously well known for basically being the boss, right? In most cases, that he knew how to design a dwelling in frontways and backwards in his sleep, so he could rattle them off. All he needed to really see was the site. And famously, every Frank Lloyd Wright house was a Frank Lloyd Wright house. It wasn't about his client, I mean, with a few exceptions, but for public buildings, you really had to pay attention. There was more give and take between Wright's imposed type and the client requirements, etc. Whereas he knew the requirements of a dwelling, or he thought he did, like the back of his hand, and that would have been. So he could probably design 50 dwellings in the time. I'm taking that off the top of my head. 50 dwellings in the time it would take him to do one commercial or public building. Great question, David.
All right, thank you for that. All right, we have a question here from Catherine Rotunda, and also I mentioned that Kate Van Haren essentially asked a very similar question, and that is, when Wright was designing the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, was his floating design that withstood the Great Kanto earthquake planned, or was it luck? And has the floating design been adopted to help with other possible earthquakes? Yeah,
it's a good question. I have thought about this, but not in this particular way. So this was good, got me thinking. The floating raft foundation was a way to spread weight over a wider area in an area of Tokyo that had once been marshland, close to the ocean. And the soil was not well compacted, right? So it was very poor in terms of its bearing capacity. So one way to get over that, and if you couldn't find bedrock at a reasonable depth, would be to spread the load, right? So the opposite way would be point loads that go down to solid bedrock, and they just simply couldn't find any in that part of Tokyo Bay, what had formerly been, if you go back far enough, part of Tokyo Bay. So the ground still is very poor. And actually, one of the effects of an earthquake is to liquefy soil, even reasonably well compacted soil, but especially stuff that has never been properly compacted next to the ocean. You'll see this. You'll see cracks in the ground, and what appears to be liquid sand pumping up through. And what's happening is, that the shaking is basically turning the soil into a suspension of solids in liquid, and that's almost certainly what happened in the Great Kanto earthquake. So the raft became even more important. So it was not the primary intent, but a very fortunate in the process, I believe, of trying to spread the load on poor ground, it actually worked very well as an anti-seismic device. And of course, Wright took, every ounce of credit for that. Again, I think retrospectively or retroactively, that he anticipated this. I don't know. I stand to be corrected here, but I don't know that that was the case. I think it was more a question of, this ground is like cheese. And in fact, he talked about that, right? And it became liquid cheese in an earthquake. He didn't know that. I don't think he knew that, right? But the solution to the poor load-bearing soil, the raft, the floating raft, is pretty good when you're literally on liquefied ground, right? So extremely fortunate happenstance, I think. And yes, it is a tried and tested now, a raft is used into, so, Tokyo and Japan in general have developed high-tech solutions to, anti-seismic design. But for a long time, in the 20th century, the raft would have been used. I don't think it's as popular today.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that answer, Kevin. So another question from Ilgen Teresa, and that is, or I'm sorry, I may have confused that. It might be Teresa Ilgen. I apologize. How practical were Wright's buildings in the Southwest? And I'm not exactly sure what exactly you're referring to. I'm assuming, Teresa, you're referring to Taliesin West. So if you want to add any clarification to that, go ahead. But were his buildings in the Southwest well designed for their environment, Kevin, in your opinion?
Yeah, I interpreted Teresa's question as meaning both Taliesin West, but also the houses in LA. But there's probably a different term for that. So Taliesin West, just to take that first, is effectively a series of heavy masses covered by lightweight shading canopies. And both are highly effective passive environmental control strategies used to this day that you want to keep out of the sun, right? And you want, and if it's going to be shade and high up, that is probably going to be lightweight, but its function is to reflect the sun and keep it off. But also to control fluctuations in temperature, having a heavy mass like the Pueblo buildings, right, of the Native Americans in that part of the world is very helpful because where the mass is exposed to the sun, it won't get hot immediately. It has such a high thermal capacity that the sun, it can absorb an enormous amount of energy without actually raising its temperature. But the really neat thing that I believe the Native Americans were aware of was that there's a time delay. So the sun, that mass of the adobe buildings would absorb heat during the day, keep the interior cool. But as you probably are aware, in arid desert climates, temperature plummets at night because you're exposed to a completely open, unclouded sky. Water will freeze, if you just expose it to the sky in the desert. It's that cold. So, that's a real problem, right? So, but if you have a large thermal mass, it will take the energy of the sun, keep it for 6, 7, 8 hours. And by the time the sun goes and you're ready to sleep, that wave of energy is coming out the inside of the wall. So it's a perfect passive system, no moving parts. So, you're out of the heat when you want to be out of the heat, and you get the sun's heat 12 or so hours later when you really need it, when the temperatures are really low. And Taliesin has two components that are very effective in that. And I don't think I can't prove, but I don't think that was coincidental. Right at the time, and you would know the Jacobs House near Madison, right? The solar hemicycle. This is way ahead of its time. The idea that you would be actively using solar energy to warm your house in a cold climate. Now the shading, not so great, and there were other issues, of course, but Wright was way ahead of the technology. So I don't think it was an accident at all, a coincidence that the Taliesin has these two really great design strategies: shading and very large thermal mass, which are great in a very clear, hot, arid climate. So on to the south, well, even more west, I suppose. The textile blockhouses, they don't have the shading, but they do, of course, have the thermal mass. And from what I've read, I don't know, I haven't heard what the owner said, but they certainly did remain, because of their thermal mass, they did remain, so almost like being in a cave. You get a fairly even temperature during the day. You don't get these massive fluctuations, no pun intended, large fluctuations that you would get in a lightweight structure. So they perform environmentally. Now, there are all sorts of questions about their style and what the interior environments were, but they do function very well, again, in a not quite as arid, but similar climate. So I'd say the simple answer would be better than most, especially at that time, better than many today. To my knowledge, the textile blockhouses never needed air conditioning, and Taliesin, probably has it now, but not at the time. In fact, that would have been woe betide somebody who mentioned that to Wright, I think. I was just writing to somebody this morning saying, hey, this thing about COVID and artificial ventilation, of course, saved millions of lives, but the artificial ventilation of buildings collectively is probably killing us slowly, because it's not very good for the health. So I'm digressing, but that literally was this morning. So so they were way ahead of most of his contemporaries in terms of their environmental control, passive environmental control strategies. Really sophisticated. Nobody was doing this at the time. Nobody felt it was a completely different world, right? Global warming was not a thing. Sustainability was not a word. And yet Wright was doing this. That's extraordinary. Prescient.
Yeah.
The sad thing is that many more architects should be doing those things today, and are not. So I'm quite proud. I'm not sure that I have the right to be, that he was doing that, as a great example. In fact, there's a book I just bought when I realized that, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. Somebody wrote a book about this, so I'm looking forward to that. Frank Lloyd Wright, Natural Design, Organic Architecture. It's written by two Allens, Alan Hess and Alan Weintraub. Right? So I'm looking forward to reading that, because it's a story that needs to be told. We've all kind of known it, but that everybody knew that Wright was influenced by Japan, but you got to actually show it, right? And they've done it apparently, so that's great. I take my hat off to that.
Well, Kevin, I've noticed that you write a book about every 2 years, so maybe you can add this to your queue.
You're being very kind. Well, they already did it, so I'm off the hook, I think. But
okay.
But you're missing out the hiatus of about 18 years there. So
all right. Well,
you average it out, it's more like every 5, if I'm honest.
We have another question about Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings that I really want to get to, but we have had a question from the audience, and
Sure.
And Kevin, I think this is a really prescient question. It says, if Wright, it's a speculative one, but that's we can do that. That's fun. If Wright was to look at his buildings, which still exist today, or maybe even those we have lost, which ones do you feel he would want to be preserved as an example of his work?
Wow. First of all, they're all his children, right? So how do you sort of say, yeah, you can, I don't need that one. There probably were, if he was honest, there were probably buildings that he would. Think about it. If you're mortal, and he was, one of the hardest things is everything that we do. We know that we put the effort into, but then when you get a bit of perspective, you kind of go, yeah, not everything that I've done is of an equal. There are some definite stragglers there that if we're not there, the average would actually go up. And I tell students this all the time. having the nerve to sort of say, yeah, I did them all, but these are not doing me any favors. They're dragging the others down, and not having them see the light of day is actually beneficial. It's a really important skill and hard to learn. So Wright probably would have, it's a great question. I think he probably would have said, yeah, I think my reputation would be better if that never existed. Could you get rid of that one, I don't know what buildings that would be, but there are certainly buildings that some of the stuff from the 50s, that I would, that I found like, and if you're 90 and still practicing architecture, I mean, geez, it's probably not going to be your best work. Having said that, Guggenheim was very late, although the idea came very early. So there are a few buildings that I think he probably would have liked back, and I think that just shows to me, that's hopeful in the sense of he wasn't a god. He wasn't, he had extraordinary talent and skills, but he is somebody that we can learn from. And for a long time, when I was writing about him, or at least before, there was a sense of, well, he's a genius, so forget it, move on. You're not going to learn from that unless you're a genius. In which case, why do you need to learn from another? And I felt that was deeply unsatisfactory. That just because he had levels of skill that were way above most of us, it doesn't mean that we can't learn some of those skills, even if we can't execute them anything near as well. So the idea that you can write, that we can learn from Wright, I think is really important, and that's kind of why we're here, right? In every sense. Maybe there are things we can learn from Wright about his social life. Yeah, do this, don't do that. But yeah, so I can't off the top of my head think of buildings that I would be sure that he'd want back, but there are a few that, and then there are all the supposed Frank Lloyd Wright buildings out there that there's no actual documented evidence. There's supposed to be one in Hawaii. Well, not that I'm, so I certainly, he'd like all of those demolished for sure. Any Frank Lloyd Wright knockoffs pretending to be Frank Lloyd Wright, absolutely, bulldoze them immediately, if he had his way. But for his own work, I think he was not sentimental. What he said about Midway Gardens when it got demolished because of prohibition, right? And he took great glee. I don't know if this counts as mean, but he said the demolition contractor went bankrupt, and he took great pleasure in that because it was so well built in reinforced concrete that he went bankrupt in trying to take it down. So I don't think it was too super. What is the word? Sentimental about. I think he felt that a building should belong to its place and its time, and if the time had moved on, then so be it. You don't sort of hang on to it as a sort of relic. But of course, he wants to be remembered, and his buildings are his legacy, of course. So,
All right, thank you for that question,
yeah, great question.
That's a really great question. All right, there's one more question, Kevin. We're at 1 hour, but there's one more question I want to get in because it's one that really stuck out to me too. And
Sure.
This is asked by Naya Gibson. And she says, many of Wright's homes structures were built before the technological building materials had been invented to bring his ideas fully to fruition. If these designs were built now, would they have the same construction issues, or is he still a man ahead of his time? And one of the reasons this question spoke to me so much is I knew nothing about Frank Lloyd Wright before I started working with you on this, and I was surprised to learn how many of his buildings had issues like leaky roofs or other things that, frankly, as a homeowner, I'm happy to live in a box within a box within a box, as long as it doesn't leak, as long as it keeps me warm in the wintertime. So and this is probably showing my naivete that I was shocked to learn that a lot of Wright's buildings had structural issues. So was that because he was ahead of his time? Could you build them more efficiently today? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, they would. It's a really good point. And I have to confess to being somebody who wrote a book about bringing the weather into buildings. So I am certainly not unbiased. the absolute reverse of what you're told in Architecture 101. That the weather is the enemy and you're supposed to keep it. I wrote a book about how to bring it in. So, you're not probably talking to the best person to answer this question. But having said that, Yeah, Wright's building, it is a great question because it comes up all the time. Wright's buildings would generate very few technical issues today. Technology is caught up. But if Wright was alive today, he'd still be pushing the limits. So what he did then, not a challenge at all now. But if Wright were around, not just his buildings, he would still be, doing stuff. He was, I hate to say this because, I probably shouldn't, but I thought about this in the last few days, people that are kind of obnoxious, but at least to me, but have done amazing things. People like Elon Musk, love the work, but the personality. And I don't think Wright was anywhere near as obnoxious. I don't know. I didn't live with him, nor do I do with Musk, but I hear more about Musk. So he would have been. He was interested in the future, so he wouldn't have been satisfied in just doing the safe. He'd have been saying, well, can we do this in a new material or whatever? Hopefully he would have been doing it in sustainable materials, not just, I think, I speculated with somebody the other day that you'd probably be building buildings out of paper that would just disintegrate, after 50 years or 30 years. Not good if you're the mortgage owner, of course. I'm not sure how the banks, the mortgage lenders would see that, but yes, on the question of the big cantilevers and the Pyrex tubes at the Johnson Wax Tower, that stuff is all super easy now. But the technology was just not good. And other architects actually came a cropper with saying, hey, this is the latest best thing, let's use it. And they turned their buildings into laboratories. Well, guess what? Experiments sometimes don't turn out the way that so that's kind of, sounds like an excuse. I guess it's an excuse, but, I would argue that if you're being leaked on in a Frank Lloyd Wright building, it's better than being leaked on in a spec bungalow, but I don't live in either, so I'm not. I think I would be pretty offended too. It was more,
Okay.
I've lived in non-Frank Lloyd Wright houses that leak.
Yeah. Fair enough. And Kevin, we have gotten another question. I'm not sure if it's 100% genuine or tongue in cheek, but it says from Catherine Ishida, the golf club in Maui is not a real Frank Lloyd Wright building. Are you familiar with this structure? Yeah,
no, it's not listed as far as I'm aware, Catherine. I'll look it up because this came up in another conversation a few days ago, actually, on online Zoom presentation, and I haven't seen it, but I do know that they're free. Ever since Wright died, homeowners would suddenly come up with, I've got a Frank Lloyd Wright home, which is great for your real estate value, so I'm skeptical, but I don't remember it being listed, any Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in Hawaii. Now it could be, there's got to be careful here because Taliesin Associated Architects, the company, the architectural firm that was eventually formed decades after Wright's death, might have done something and they've done it a few places where they've built a Frank Lloyd Wright design. Now, I don't know how to define that. If it was built after his death long after his death by others, maybe for a different place. I'd have to look it up. It's a great question. I think it might be a kind of maybe answer. Depends on whether you consider stuff done afterwards. It's an interesting, where's the line? How many times does that come up this morning? If he'd been in the process and died during construction, I think we'd all say, well, that's a Frank Lloyd Wright building. Of course it is. But if there are 4 decades between and it was designed for a different site, some of us would say, I don't know. That's kind of a half Frank Lloyd Wright, whatever. So it has come up. I need to check this. I said I would check it 3 weeks ago when somebody mentioned and promptly forgot about it. But I don't believe it's listed on the published list. Hawaii, to my knowledge, has no Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. But I'm open to being corrected on that, Catherine. So it's not. No, I've heard of it. She's not making this up. It's a thing. So okay. I haven't got off Wahoo in the last 18 months. I'll leave you to guess why.
I think probably the same reason why we're all on a Zoom call right now instead of heading to the terrace on the UW
Exactly.
campus.
It would have been nice. I'd love to. I have fond memories of Wisconsin. Unlike Wright, who felt, when they crossed the state line, he'd say to Ogimana, "Oh, we're back in the country where they don't think much of us."
Oh,
And it used to get to him.
yeah.
I mean, it really did. He pretended that he didn't. And I remember a story where she turned around and, I don't know, deliberately sort of gave him a pep talk and got him mad. And he gave a blistering talk, but he was depressed. He didn't want to be back because he felt like, I'm not loved here.
Yeah.
He was human. He wanted to be loved. And it hurt. Privately, it hurt.
Yeah.
And it was only by getting mad about it and kind of bluster, I suppose, that he kind of got through it.
Yeah.
Not complicated, really. It's a kind of very human, almost childlike kind of reaction to not being liked.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are at almost 10 after 5. So we will end it there today. But Kevin, thank you so much for this conversation. And yeah, let's give Kevin a virtual round of applause if possible. And thank you to all of you who submitted really great questions. And just two announcements. We'll be doing this again next week and again the week after that. So next week we'll be looking at Japanese prints with James Wen of the Chazen Museum of Art, and James is gonna take questions, but he's also gonna show you how you can access the prints in the collection at the Chazen, how you can find prints there that might be of interest to you, and also kind of go through the process of how prints are produced. And I think that'll be a really great session. And then in 2 weeks, we will have Kevin Nute back to talk this time more about Japanese art and its influence on Frank Lloyd Wright. So if you have, if our conversation today has sparked any additional questions for you, please feel free to email me or to just fill out that form that you filled out originally and add more questions to our list. And we'll go through the same process, certainly in that final session, by answering the questions you've submitted. And I think we'll also take some questions. I know James will take questions from the audience, but we'll also look at some submitted questions in our next session as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to attend. And I will hopefully be seeing many of you a week from today.